Anyone, anywhere can have a garden, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with the fact that you live in the city or that you live in an apartment. I've been gardening virtually all my life, for the last few years in the city. The garden is divided all up into different bits and pieces, here and there and everywhere. Now from this, the amount of produce is quite phenomenal. I also grow a wide variety of vegetables, over 20 different sorts of things during the course of the season. In this small backyard, I have a total area in garden. It's 260 square feet or so.
Here you go. Careful now, don't spill.
This is one of the most satisfying parts of gardening for anybody who's done it. To have a table, a meal, which has come from your own soil, from your own hands. It's satisfying because you know where the food has come from and you know the stages it's gone through to get there.
Why don't you let me do that, because I've got to serve mine, okay? That's okay. Yeah.
If you want dessert, you have to.
That's right.
Did you put the chain guard back on that red bike?
I had no soil to speak of, and that's where I started from, to build up the soil in the backyard from the rock that was there. And now, from a space that's about the size of a large living room, I feed my family of 5 for about 7 months of the year on the produce that I grow there. People, I think, often feel that they're limited by where they live as to whether they can in fact garden or not. But I would also say that there are more and more people that are trying and learning about gardens. And I feel this is very important for city people to be able to watch and nurture a growing thing. In a cold climate like ours, starting plants ahead indoors is very important. If you just planted them directly outdoors, they would of course be very, very late. Usually they're started about 6 weeks before they'd be planted outside, and then gradually adjusted to outdoor growing conditions. The transferring of seedlings from indoors to outdoors is really the crucial part of this whole process. Just as one would expose a baby to outdoor temperatures and sunshine for the first time, they're shaded a bit and then gradually left out longer and longer until they're used to the outdoor conditions. Cold frames and covering things up with old storm windows helps this process as well, because this is more like the indoor sort of greenhouse environment. Cold frames can also be used to give things in the ground a head start. Soil is really the foundation of it all. Without considering that first, city or country, you can't garden. But because there isn't good soil to start with doesn't mean in the city that you give up the operation. This is finished compost, which is essentially made out of garbage and turned into rich soil. Container gardens are an excellent way for city people to make use of small or no gardening space. Because I'm short on soil, I make up a rich mixture in sort of sandwich layers of rotted sawdust and manure with some lime in it, because the sawdust is quite acidic. I give the containers a head start by using transplants like these tomatoes. I pre-sprouted these peas so that they'll also start to grow very quickly. The rich soil from the compost goes on top, which helps to keep the containers moist and supply nutrients as well. I grow salad by the pail, a very good thing for apartment people because they can have a fresh picked salad from a tiny little bucket. Something else that helps to give plants an early start is giving them what is in essence a little miniature greenhouse. These are homemade hot caps, which are really just cut off vinegar jugs, and they're left on the plants to keep a nice, even, warm growing temperature. I seeded these turnip greens extremely early. The ground in many places was still frozen. These early crops are usually short growing season so that they can be harvested when it's become warm enough for other kinds of crops to go in. This makes good use of the soil as well as getting an early harvest. It's time now to put in the tomato transplants, which will be in there for the whole season. I prepare very deep transplant holes, put lots of manure and bone meal in the bottom. On top of that, some soil so that the roots don't get burned by the manure. And this makes an on-the-spot, rich growing area for the tomatoes to get started in. I lay the transplants on their sides, and that way they form a big root system along the sides of the stems, but they're not in the cold soil farther down. Another way to keep the heat in on these sensitive plants is to use plastic mulch, which is really just a plastic sheet with holes cut in it. I leave this on for the whole season, and it also keeps the weeds down. The tomato cage is a way of making use of a little bit of space to grow a lot of tomatoes. It's a fair bit of work getting this in at the start of the season. But once it's in place, this is the end of maintenance for the tomatoes until harvest time. A raised bed has several advantages for gardeners in city or country. The main thing for me is that the soil warms up earlier and stays warmer by 4 to 6 degrees. It's also easier to work at in a small space because it's up more at your level. It's easier to contain the soil and also keeps the soil loose because you're not walking on it. Seeding is a fairly simple procedure. You don't need to get too technical about it. You just sprinkle them around. If you don't get it just right, then you thin them out a little bit later on. It's not anything to take a great deal of time and precision about. Once they're seeded, then I cover them up about 3 times their diameter with soil and press them down a little bit. And there we are, we're all seeded for the season. In no time at all, really, the garden is up and booming and things are lovely and lush and green. This is the time to think about thinning if things have gone in a little thick. Now, thinning doesn't need to be a mysterious procedure. You just have to give the plants enough room to fill out to their full development. In fact, something like lettuce I plant on purpose too thick because the thinnings are delicious to eat. This is a very small 4 by 4 foot space which I intend to plant as intensively as possible. That means getting as many plants as I can into that small space. I'm going to start at the back with the tallest things, the Brussels sprouts. They'll be tied up to the fence, so they'll be kept out of the way. The celery that comes next will grow up in the shade of the Brussels sprouts for a while, but they like that. Then, in the next little space over farther, I'm going to put some cauliflower. Then, because there's still some space, I'm going to plant some romaine lettuce in between the cauliflower rows. This is something that's called intercropping, growing 2 things that have different maturity times and growth patterns in exactly the same space. Thinking about this tiny little 4 by 4 foot spot, that's an incredible amount of food that's coming out of there. Up to this point, with the first crop and then the planting of the second crop, the garden has taken a fair bit of time and work and thought and energy. But really, from this point onwards, the hard part of the gardening season is done and the rewards begin. This little tomato plant is probably going to reach to the top of the ladder. This is a fun thing I do every year because it's exciting to see how much it grows every day. But it also makes very good use of space, since literally hundreds and hundreds of Sweet 100 tomatoes will cover the ladder by the end of the season. I always sprinkle in a few new seeds in areas like this where these lettuces have come out. By never leaving a bare spot, the garden will keep right on producing until the final ground frees up. One of the real problems this time of year with replanting in bare patches are the cats in the city environment. I keep my old raspberry canes that I've trimmed out and put them on top of the new seeding so that the cats won't find it such a comfy spot. With the warm weather here, this is also the time to think about mulching. This rotted sawdust, or grass clippings, or leaves, or seaweed are all excellent mulches, and they improve the soil at the same time. Mulching is really covering over the soil between plants to keep the weeds out. But the other thing that it does is to keep the moisture in and to encourage the earthworms to dig around and keep the soil nice and loose. The pests and the nuisances are going to be around. There are aphids on these roses. This sweet little butterfly is actually a cabbage moth that's going to lay eggs to become the dreadful cabbage worm to chop all the leaves. Every garden has bugs, mine included. You couldn't grow things otherwise. But because the soil is very healthy, the plants are then very healthy, and the damage isn't enough to seriously interfere with my harvest. One of the best ways to get a healthy soil is to use all sorts of garbage to create new, rich soil. This is called composting. You need something dry like leaves or straw or sawdust, and something high in nitrogen like manure or kitchen vegetable wastes. On top of that, I'll put a little sprinkling of soil. It helps to keep down the odors, and it also adds the soil microorganisms that help to work on the stuff and rot it better. I don't use any chemical fertilizers in my garden. The soil enrichment takes the place of that. So I make something called manure tea, which is an in-season way of fertilizing plants that are already planted. Flowers are an essential part of a garden for me. They add the extra dimension of just pure pleasure to watch them in the garden or inside the house when I bring them in. And of course the flowers of the vegetables themselves are always exciting. This is prime harvest time. The beans have come in prolific numbers as usual. Tomatoes are starting to ripen. Lots of peppers. This is about a half hour's worth of picking on one day. So this is an indication of the kinds of possibilities that exist, even in a small garden in the city, and most particularly, even in a place where there isn't any good soil to start with. The days are getting cooler now, and fall is certainly coming. This doesn't mean the end of the garden produce. The things that are producing will go on until the final freeze-up. For other things, it's time to clear out what there is left. The peppers have had a frost and they're not going to produce anymore. So I'm pulling out the old vines. I'll put them in the compost so that next year they'll be improving the soil. There isn't anywhere in this city, and I think most others, where you can't get literally tons of leaves, which are excellent for enriching the soil. They have all kinds of trace nutrients, and also the basic ones as well. So if you gather the leaves in the fall and put them in layers with manure, and cover them over with soil, by spring this will be starting to break down and you'll have a nice rich growing bed. One of the most exciting parts of the gardening year for me comes in January, when all the seed catalogs have arrived and I'm busy daydreaming, thinking about what it is that I'll do in this space or that space and how I'll change things, what new varieties I'll try. Every year of gardening you learn more about your particular piece of land and how the different vegetables grow. You can change and move around anything in terms of making a productive growing space. For the city person, then, it is all possible. I would say start small and enrich the soil and then move on from there.